Not everything is always as it seems at first glance, and people are no exception. Take a closer look at those around you. You may notice that one of your acquaintances or neighbors is behaving unusually. Their actions might appear to be innocent jokes or idle chatter, but sometimes there is more to it than that. This is a story about a transformation that society realized too late. It is reminiscent of the prose of life, where trust and kindness can sometimes turn into betrayal and fear. Theodore Shaughnessy, the youngest of 3 children in the family, was born on February 7, 1963. His relatives, who lived in Arizona near Phoenix, called him Ted. From a very young age, all the children in the family were fascinated by speed, so it's no surprise that Ted grew up with a love for fast cars and everything related to them. The boy dreamed of sports cars since childhood. Friends and relatives described him as a brave and fearless young man for whom adrenaline was the best medicine. Despite this, Ted was a kind, cheerful person and a good friend, son, and brother. In the early 1980s, at a video arcade in Phoenix, Ted met Corey Harmon. The young people quickly found common ground and began dating, marrying at the end of the decade. The couple moved to Austin, Texas, where they started their own jewelry business. It was a high-level joint venture in which each of them invested a part of themselves. Corey was in love with precious stones and fine art, so in the family company, she worked as an appraiser. And Ted became the face of their store. He had an incredible knack for communication, knew how to attract people's attention, and quickly found common ground with them. Wherever Ted appeared, he immediately became the life of the party. This greatly helped in business. The man easily negotiated with customers and partners, achieving favorable terms and leaving everyone satisfied. Ted and Corey perfectly complemented each other, forming a well-coordinated tandem. Their fortune was estimated at $8 million. According to those close to them, Theodore was generous and often bought groceries for those in need. The family business continued to grow, so the couple purchased a beautiful new home near their store. By 2000, the successful family had brought to life the true American dream, however with one peculiarity: they had 2 Rottweiler dogs. In a sense, they replaced children for the couple, because despite their great desire to become parents, they could not conceive a baby. But in the spring of 2000, Ted and Corey flew to Ukraine, where they adopted an 18-month-old boy they named Nicholas. This event became the long-awaited motherhood and fatherhood for the Shaughnessy family. It seemed that now they had everything necessary for happiness. Years passed, and Nick grew up. Like his father, he loved fast cars and the feeling of speed. To experience these emotions, the father and son often went go-karting, and Ted also took the child for rides in sports cars. The boy began to show business acumen. Back in middle school, he sold chocolate bars right out of his school locker, always having pocket money. In high school, Nick became passionate about working on cars. His parents helped him financially to start this business. The young man purchased the necessary equipment and involved his friends in the work. At one point, he already had 4 people working for him. Around the same time, in 2015, Nick met a girl named Jacqueline Edison, whom everyone called Jackie. She had just moved from New York to Texas. Immediately after their first meeting, the young couple felt a mutual attraction, but the girl did not appeal to Nicholas' mother and father. Corey intuitively felt that Jackie was not right for her son. However, no one stood in the way of the teenagers' relationship so as not to lose touch with Nick. After graduating from high school, the young lovebirds moved into a townhouse near the town of College Station. There, Jackie planned to study engineering while her boyfriend was in business. During that period, he became interested in trading, so he did not sever ties with his parents and visited them in Austin every weekend, making a 2-hour trip. It seemed that everything in life was going smoothly, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. On March 2, 2018, at 4:30 a.m., Ted and Corey were awakened by the barking of dogs. In general, this was not something unusual, as the animals often actively reacted to possums or other small animals that sometimes wandered into the yard. The wife believed there was nothing to worry about, but 55-year-old Ted decided to check what the matter was. Since they lived in Texas, the man took his .45 caliber pistol with him. According to Corey, as soon as her husband went to survey the area, she put her head on the pillow and almost immediately dozed off. But just a few seconds later, the woman heard a shot from the kitchen, followed by a whole series of shots. Frightened, Corey grabbed her revolver, which was always by the bed, and ran to help her husband. In the bedroom doorway, she saw her beloved dog, shot dead. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the passageway, looking threatening. Scared, Corey opened fire, firing all 6 bullets towards the door. She didn't figure out who or what was there, and immediately after that barrage of fire, she rushed into the pantry and hid. Expecting to be found and shot, the story's heroine managed to grab her cell phone and dial 911. She reported that a killer had broken into the house and that she had shot one of the attackers. During the conversation with the dispatcher, the woman heard moans coming from somewhere in the house. The frightened Corey didn't know for sure who was making those sounds. She assumed it was her husband, wounded in the shootout, and wanted to go out to help him. But the dispatcher advised her not to leave the hiding place under any circumstances, because it could be dangerous. 15 minutes later, Corey was informed that the police were already on the scene. By that time, the moans had subsided, and a deathly silence had fallen over the house. The woman came out of the pantry and headed for the front door. Moving towards the kitchen, the woman saw her husband lying in a pool of blood with no signs of life. It seemed that the person with whom she had shared her life for 3 decades was dead. Shells were scattered around on the floor. Suppressing her fear, Corey made it to the front door and opened it, but there was no one on the doorstep. As it turned out, the police officers had confused the houses due to the unusual arrangement of the lots on this street. At that very moment, the officers were standing at the neighbor's house, trying to determine where the shots were coming from. Finally, they oriented themselves and approached the Shaughnessy family's home, where they saw a woman trembling with shock on the doorstep. She was immediately put into a police car and taken to the station. On the way, Corey called her son and informed him of his father's death. Nick and his girlfriend immediately got into the car and headed towards his parents' house. They arrived in town around 8 in the morning and met with the mother, whose life had turned into ruins overnight. The woman still couldn't comprehend what had happened, but she realized that her husband was gone. For the next 3 months, the son and Jackie lived in the house with the mother, providing her with much-needed support. Everyone who knew the family was shocked by the tragedy. The victim was described as a good-natured man who had worked hard all his life and undoubtedly deserved to live to a ripe old age. No one could have imagined that he had deadly enemies capable of shooting him point-blank in the middle of the night. Rumors immediately spread that the attack was caused by the elderly couple's wealth, as the house contained many valuables. Law enforcement officials thoroughly examined the crime scene. 2 types of shell casings were found there, .40 and .380 caliber. Obviously, 2 attackers had shot at Ted with different weapons. Although no signs of a break-in were found, an open window with a removed screen was discovered in the far bedroom. It appears that the criminals entered the house through it. On the windowsill, forensic specialists were lucky to find a fingerprint, which was immediately sent to the lab for examination. In the same room where Nick used to live and where the burglars probably ended up, there was a cabinet with a sliding drawer for a .40 caliber pistol. The weapon itself was not there. It turned out to be the only thing missing from the house. Considering that the caliber matched one of the guns used during the massacre, the detectives assumed that it was the one used to kill the owner. After talking to the Shaughnessy family and their neighbors, the police found out that everyone around knew about the jewelry store owned by the couple. In fact, it was quite a serious business, the value of which was estimated at millions of dollars. The widow of the deceased, his son, and Nick's girlfriend Jackie handed over their cell phones to investigators. Since the family was wealthy, the version of a connection with a criminal who might eliminate all family members one by one was considered. The officers assumed that they were all in great danger, so the detectives acted as quickly as possible. Nicholas had an alibi. At the time of the attack, he was 2 hours' drive away from his parents' house. His phone was then recorded in the College Station area. The house had a security system operated through a mobile app. Since the boys' parents were not very tech-savvy, Nick set up the equipment for them. Interestingly, on the night of the shooting, the security system was found to be turned off, which immediately aroused suspicion. According to the young man, there was nothing unusual about this. When his mother and father stayed at home together, sometimes they simply did not turn on the security system, although even in sleep mode it could provide some information. Investigators were able to establish that the criminals could have entered the house at 4:27 a.m., that's when the electronics were deactivated. The next signal came at 4:44, meaning the attacker was in the house for about 17 minutes. There were rumors that jewelry worth millions of dollars could be stored there, so the burglars were probably trying to find it. In addition to gold, there were safes and expensive items in the house, but none of them were missing, so the robbery version seemed unlikely. Moreover, the criminal clearly had more knowledge about his victims than a random thief, since he managed to find the gun that was later presumably used during the shootout. The behavior of the dogs raised even more questions. How could they not hear or sense the strangers and not raise the alarm for 17 minutes? Usually, the animals would start barking even when an unfamiliar car stopped in the driveway. Something was clearly wrong here. Nicholas shared an interesting story with the police that happened in the 90s. At that time, his father owned a video store, which was once broken into by armed robbers. The criminals opened fire, but Ted did not lose his head and used his own weapon. He managed to wound one of the criminals. Both attackers were later sentenced to imprisonment for attempted armed robbery. The son suggested that they might have been released and decided to take revenge. A check of the information showed that the men had indeed been released from prison shortly before the bloody tragedy. However, it was proven that at the time of the massacre of Ted, both suspects were far from the crime scene and had a solid alibi. Nicholas actively shared various guesses with the police. Another version he voiced concerned revenge on the part of a neighbor, carried out by mistake. A private detective had been following this man for a long time at the request of his wife, and even installed a tracking device on his car. Thanks to this, it was possible to expose the unfaithful husband's infidelity, after which the woman initiated a divorce process, hoping to benefit from the situation. It was not ruled out that the offended man wanted to take revenge, but confused the houses. This could have happened in the same way as with the police officers who first arrived at the neighbor's house when Nicholas' mother called for help. Later, this lead also turned out to be dead-end. The first among the suspects was the 58-year-old widow of the deceased. In fact, the family's house contained about 24 pistols, placed in special safes on all floors, in almost every room. Such an excessive amount of weapons did not cause surprise, as it was explained by the large valuables stored in the house. Suspicions were also raised by the fact that the wife was the sole beneficiary of Ted's life insurance policy. The woman was entitled to receive $1 million. And indeed, shortly after her husband's death, Corey contacted the insurance company with a demand to pay the money. She argued that Ted was the face of their business, and now, in these difficult conditions, things had gone downhill without him. Sales volumes had plummeted, customers had begun to turn away, and there were problems with suppliers. It was the sudden need for money that forced the widow to contact the insurers as soon as possible. However, they refused to pay Corey, because by that time she was already considered a suspect in the murder of her own husband. That's how the woman found out that she had come under the sights of the investigation, which greatly outraged her. According to Corey, the initiative to buy numerous pistols belonged to her late husband. She herself used only one for self-defense, the revolver she fired on the night of Ted's murder. Ballistic examination did not confirm that the shots that killed the man were fired from Corey's weapon. But despite this, during that period she came under the close attention of investigators. Cars without license plates regularly visited the house. Obviously, the woman was being watched. The son of the deceased and his fiancée were also considered suspects. When law enforcement officers searched Nick and Jackie's home, they came across a marriage certificate. It turned out that the young couple had secretly married 8 months ago without their parents' knowledge. Nicholas' mother found out about this only from the police. The news came as a complete surprise to the woman, who had never approved of her son's choice. Jackie first appeared on the doorstep of their home back in 2016. But only after Ted's death did Corey realize that now they needed to stick together. She sincerely accepted her daughter-in-law into the family, even giving her a gold diamond jewelry piece as a wedding gift. From then on, Nicholas and his wife began working in the family jewelry store, replacing the deceased father. It seemed that this would help them to escape from the bitter loss, and also support the widowed Corey during a difficult period. Meanwhile, the results of the analysis of the fingerprint found on the window of the Shaughnessy house came in. It turned out that it belonged to a worker who had installed windows there at one time and apparently left a trace during the installation. Interestingly, in fact, that man did not even live in Texas, his home was in Minnesota. In addition, he had an unshakable alibi. Despite this, the police could not reject the version of the window as a possible point of entry for the criminal into the house. One of the detectives noticed that during interrogations, Nick repeatedly mentioned how he himself used the window when he returned home tipsy after parties or simply did not want to disturb his parents who were already asleep. And this was despite the fact that the investigators never hinted to him that it was through the window that the criminals had presumably reached the house. During one of the interrogations, Nicholas spoke about his best friend Spencer, with whom he had been close friends for many years. The young man often visited the Shaughnessy house. At the same time, he came from a poorer family and hated his job, so, according to Nick, he could envy his wealthier and happier friend. From Nicholas, Spencer knew how to get into the house, because that window was usually left open. Nick assumed that it was through it that the criminals got inside. In addition, Spencer had been a guest at the Shaughnessy's more than once, so he knew where the family safes and gun cabinets were located. During one of the interrogations, Nicholas admitted that he had previously given his friend a .380 caliber pistol. Thus, the theory coincided with one of the murder weapons, the shell casings of which were found at the scene of the massacre. The detectives decided to question Spencer. He confirmed that he knew almost everything about the Shaughnessy family and had indeed been to their house many times. He even provided the police with the .380 caliber pistol given to him by Nick. The seized pistol was sent for ballistic examination. The results showed that it was not fired during the murder. Eventually, Spencer was excluded from the circle of suspects, but it was he who led the police to think about the involvement of Nicholas himself in the crime. Law enforcement officers could not help but notice how actively the victim's son offered them various versions, none of which were ultimately confirmed. Could the adopted son of the businessman be involved in his death? Is he capable of killing a person who had done so much for him? It was on the example of the situation with Spencer that investigators suspected the ominous plan of the criminal. Nick portrayed his friend's life as a complete routine that he was supposedly tired of. In addition, Shaughnessy's son gave his buddy a pistol of the same caliber, the shell casings of which were found at the scene of the massacre. Nicholas himself told the police about the window. All this seemed too precise to be a coincidence. Throughout the investigation, Nick repeatedly drew attention to himself with strange behavior. The day after the murder, he personally went to the neighbors and asked them various questions. It seemed as if the young man was trying to take the investigation into his own hands. When everyone who was present in the Shaughnessy house at the time of the tragedy had their fingerprints and DNA samples taken, Nicholas was surprisingly cheerful. He was shaking with excitement. Having returned to his parents' home, Nick immediately went to the same window through which the criminals had presumably entered. The young man studied the frame for a long time but said nothing. In fact, it turned out that the young man had serious financial difficulties. Trading was not bringing in money, and Nicholas was spending all the funds his parents gave him on it. His own business had come to a dead end, and despite this, he was not going to look for a job. For a long time, his mother and father supported their son, paid all the bills, but at the same time expected that the young man would finally begin to take care of himself independently. Shortly before the tragedy, they lent their adopted son $30,000 as a fund to pay for his future college education. However, Nick was not planning to either enroll or get an education. He simply spent the money on trading and other needs. After that, his parents refused to provide financial assistance, hoping to encourage him to start building a career in his own life. That is why Ted and Corey insisted that the young couple live separately. They believed that living together with a girl would benefit Nicholas, and he would think about going to college, as Jackie had done. Instead, he borrowed another $5,000 from a family friend, still did not find a job, and continued to bet on trading. But it was all in vain. As the police found out, Nick never returned the debt, which became a common occurrence for him. It was obvious to his parents that this way of life would not help their son get on his feet. So the detectives assumed that it was the financial issue that could have become the motive for the brutal attack. However, Nicholas had an alibi. Perhaps the adopted son did not shoot Ted with his own hands, but for this, he could hire perpetrators. To check this version, the investigators visited Nick and Jackie's house again. This time, they found several boxes of cartridges there, the brands and calibers of which coincided with the shell casings found at the scene of the murder. Moreover, exactly 6 rounds from the box were missing. Soon the police managed to expose another lie of the suspect. Previously, Nicholas claimed that he had not visited his parents for a long time, but the cops found out that a couple of days before the tragedy, on February 28, he still came to his parents' house. The young man denied this, but the investigators found indisputable proof of his deception. Interestingly, 2 days before the attack on Ted, a large gap appeared in the messengers on Nick and Jackie's cell phones. Naturally, the lovers constantly kept in touch through messages and calls, but during that period they did not write a single word to each other. After checking the couple's phones, the police found that they had been thoroughly cleaned shortly before the start of the investigation. It seemed as if many messages had been edited or deleted altogether, and the devices themselves had been reset to factory settings. However, despite such foresight, Nicholas and Jackie did not take one thing into account: all the information was duplicated on the computer. When the police finally managed to gain access to the couple's incriminating correspondence, it became clear why they were in such a hurry to get rid of traces on their phones. It turned out that their financial situation was much worse than Nick had told his parents. The detectives decided to interrogate Spencer again, because they felt that he was hiding something. Indeed, the young man confessed that shortly before the massacre, Nicholas had offered him money for the murder of his own parents. By carrying out this plan, Nick could count on an inheritance of about $8 million, taking into account all the property acquired thanks to the family business. Spencer claimed that he would also receive part of this amount, but refused to participate in the crime. After that, Nicholas allegedly threatened to kill him if his friend blabbed. Corey, despite all the family feuds with her son, refused to believe it. Therefore, to protect Nick, she hired the best lawyer in the district. The woman was convinced that her son, like herself, had become a victim of police arbitrariness. After all, in the initial stages of the investigation, Corey was also considered one of the suspects. On May 29, 2018, Nicholas and Jackie were arrested on charges of incitement to murder. According to state law, this crime was punishable by the death penalty. Corey still believed that a fatal mistake had occurred, because she did not know about the evidence that law enforcement officials had. When Jackie was released on bail 2 months later, the widowed woman decided that the case against her son was also about to fall apart. The loving mother hoped to see Nick at liberty soon, but things turned out differently. Investigators managed to track down the real criminals who directed the actions of hired killers while being 2 hours' drive away from the Shaughnessy family's house. Detectives found surveillance camera footage from February 28. It captured 2 unknown men, one of whom worked for a window installation company. It was his fingerprint that was found at the beginning of the investigation, but the suspect had a reliable alibi. After contacting the window company, the police found out that this employee's name was Cameron Vosmek. They visited him again at his home, but the man himself was not there. Instead, the cops talked to his wife, who immediately stated that she knew why the police had come to them. The woman reported that Cameron had refused to participate in the crime, but his 21-year-old colleague John Miller might be involved. Law enforcement officers quickly found John. At first, he denied any role in the tragic events, but then confessed that Nicholas had promised him $100,000 for killing his parents. Miller continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that he had gone to the Shaughnessy house together with Nick, who had personally dealt with his father, and John had only helped him. Specialists checked the data from the suspect's cell phone. It turned out that at about the time of the murder, he was in the area of the crime scene. Eventually, the young man admitted his complicity and even asked for the death penalty for himself, because he could no longer bear the burden of guilt. According to John, he fired from the pistol given to him by Nicholas. It was the same .40 caliber weapon that had disappeared from the Shaughnessy couple's house. During the investigation, it was proven that the adopted son had personally turned off the security system in his parents' home. Upon learning this, Corey finally realized what a monster she had actually raised. The woman could no longer deny the involvement of her adopted son in the crime. But what shocked her the most was that for 3 months after her husband's death, she had lived under the same roof with a person who was actually planning to send her to the other world as well. When the revelations were just beginning, Nick suddenly stated that his father had been suffering from depression for a long time, so his son allegedly did him a favor by taking his life. The widowed Corey called this an outright lie, because Ted had never had any problems with his mental health or emotional state. Jackie repeatedly denied any involvement in the murder, did not acknowledge the existence of Ted's depression, and also categorically refused to admit that she knew anything at all about Nicholas' plans. The girl denied everything until the last moment and refused to cooperate with the investigation. She was only trying to avoid responsibility, but later it was proven that this was all a lie. Jackie did not directly participate in the crime, but she knew about it. And, as she later stated herself, she tried to dissuade Nick from the terrible plan, but to no avail. However, no one believed this, because the girl could have informed the police about her husband's criminal intentions, but she did not do so. She was released on bail only because Jackie agreed to cooperate with the investigation and testify against Nicholas. After that, she simply continued to live her life. She went to college, attended parties, as if forgetting about Nick's fate. All this time, the police managed to track down Arian Smith, the second man who shot at Ted. Both he and Nicholas could have received the death penalty, but they made a deal with the investigation. In April 2021, both pleaded guilty to a less serious crime. In exchange, they received 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole from June 2023. The criminals are still behind bars. Jackie got off even easier thanks to her cooperation with law enforcement. She was sentenced to 4 months in prison and 10 years of probation. Corey's life was completely shattered. She never recovered from the terrible shock. The woman still writes letters to her son in prison, but she cannot find the strength to send even one of them. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.